So far we've been considering Daniel 2, the statue. Especially there we zoomed into the feet now, where we saw that iron and clay is mingled. We saw that iron is that Rome continues, Western Rome continues, and that the clay is the Catholic Church. And there's a unique relationship between the two, and this is the one we've been considering lately, or in the last couple presentations. We said that in 395 AD, Rome was divided into west and east. And from that moment on, they go parallel in history. And the Eastern Empire is the Byzantine Empire. And till when does it last? I asked you yesterday, I'll ask you today again. Till 1453. What happens to the West? It dissolves into 10 kings, right? Or the 10 horns of Daniel 7, or the 10 toes in Daniel 2. And the 10 kings we see here. At the statue down here, we see the 10 different tribes. And we started reading of the book, Truth Triumphant, especially there the chapter 10 is describing the history. Previously, we've considered also how Rome was the center of Christianity, which puts its elbows out to be the supreme center of Christianity among Christians. We have Alexandria and Rome, which both go into apostasy, and they disfellowship Antioch, which was the true church, having the true faith. We talked yesterday about how Rome started to be the supreme Christian center by them using the method to spread their influence everywhere, by introducing false doctrines mingled with paganism, false ideas. We can read those in chapter 3 of the Great Controversy. Things like the false Sabbath or image worshipping, or other things like that, the way how sin is atoned for. Things like that were introduced into the Roman Church, which caused people to fear, to have a faith full of fear, and caused them to have respect for the Roman Catholic Church and follow it. So we see that the Roman Catholic Church is in apostasy, but it's gaining power, authority, and influence. And at the same time, we see how Western Rome is divided into 10 kings. And we started reading there on page 43 under the title, How the Church Was Driven into the Wilderness. There in the second paragraph, it says, from 250 to about 500, the Teutonic masses poured over the provinces of Western Europe and formed 10 new nations. And then the 10 nations are being listed. However, we know that how many horns do have to be plucked up for the papacy to be able to rule? 3, right? That's why we have this little line here. So we have the Heruli here, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths. And yesterday we read a little bit the story of how the Vandals were plucked up, and we ended with the Ostrogoths being plucked up. Somehow in this particular chapter of Truth Triumphant, you can only see the history of the Vandals and the Ostrogoths. I haven't spent much time yet to study about when the Heruli were plucked up, but once I Googled it quickly, it said that the Heruli lost their kingdom to the Lombards between 494 and 508. So they were one of the first ones to be plucked up. So we read yesterday, we're now on page 44, about Clovis. What did Clovis do? Clovis, to what tribe did he belong? The Franks, right? And the Franks started here out in northern France. And what did Clovis try to do? Clovis' intentions was to stop the invasion of those Teutonics from the east, sweeping over the Europe. And why does he connect with the papacy? It says on page 44, the first real paragraph, slash the second paragraph, observing the power and influence of the papacy, and anxious to avail himself of papal support, he professed conversion 496, and his entire following united with him in adherence to Catholicism, 3,000 of whom were baptized along with himself soon after his conversion. As he expected, the Catholics rallied around him as the only Catholic prince in the West. So we considered a little bit the history of Clovis. So Clovis, he observes the power and influence the Catholic Church has everywhere in Europe. We talked a little bit about that yesterday. The command to the Christians was to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ everywhere in the world. And all of them actually obeyed that command. The gospel went everywhere. But with it also went everywhere the influence of those people who spread the gospel. And the Roman Church, which was an apostasy, its influence spread also everywhere. And Clovis sees that this influence he can use. Yesterday I gave to somebody a little bit a parable to that. It is like when you were 15 years ago in Germany a vegetarian, there were not very much vegetarian meat substitutes. And people would say, how do you get your iron? Or how do you get your vitamin B12 or protein or other things? And it was very uncommon to be a vegetarian. But today, when you go in the store, you get a lot of vegan or vegetarian things. What has changed? The population of Germany, 10% of it by today are vegetarians or vegans. So what do the companies see? They see they can do some business there, right? Therefore, they produce now these things and to get more money. So that's the same what the civil authorities in this world do. They see that there is a faith, the Catholic faith, and it has its arms everywhere. It has a large influence everywhere. So they see, why don't use this influence for ourselves? That is exactly what Clovis does. He professed to be converted to Christian faith, but it was only profession. We read with Brother Wilkinson that he actually was more a political act. Do you remember that? Yep. Okay, that was on page 44. And we saw how Clovis now, professing to have adopted this new faith now, he goes and conquers the tribes and nations around him with the profession that he wants to spread Christianism everywhere, and he wants to defeat the Arian cause. Do you remember we talked about the Arians? The Arians were those people who were not accepting the faith of Rome. They were protesting Rome. I'm not saying that all the Arians had the correct faith. I'm just pointing out here that they were the ones not trying to sit in one boat with Rome. And Clovis is the one who is trying to defeat them. He's going against those people who protest Rome. So out of these 10 kings, we have now Clovis, who is the first Catholic prince in the West. So I'll put a crown on him. And once he had defeated the Visigoths, he had defeated the pagan supremacy in the West. And this happened, and then the emperor in the East, as well as the Pope, they, so to speak, thanked him for his things he's done. And this is in 508. This is where he's considered to be crowned as the first Catholic prince in the West. And this is also marking where the pagan supremacy was stopped or cut down, defeated. This is where paganism was taken away. And we see now 30 years where the papal church will have a preparation time where it will fully sit on the throne of these 10 kings. So what was the what was the wife of Clovis? I almost gave it away, my punchline where I want to go. What was the wife, what faith did she have? She was a Catholic, right? He was a pagan, but he converted. And we know that paganism has to give room for what? Papalism. So we have paganism. In order so that papalism can come up, it has to be removed. And if you remember, the other day we paralleled that. Remember, the punchline of this study is to show that Rome, I don't have the statue anymore, but Rome continues. There is iron in the feet. And we're looking how the crown of Rome is traced through history. Right now, it's with the Franks, with Clovis. And my punchline of this study, as we saw with the eagles on, what page was it? 52. You see the eagles. My punchline is that the crown of the Western Roman Empire is in the hands of the United States. And we see that the Pope, we reference the Time magazine quite often now, is striving again for the new Roman Empire, the global reach of Pope Francis. So what is it today that has to go away or be taken out of the way in order that the Pope can be again sitting on the throne of this earth? Okay, paganism has to go away again, okay, but we don't call it paganism today. How's the United States described in the Bible? Apostate Protestantism, okay, but the Bible uses what symbol to describe kingdoms? Animals, right? In the United States, how many animals describe the United States? 2, right? A lamb and a dragon. So which one has to be taken out of the way? The lamb. The lamb has to be taken out of the way in order for what? For the dragon to come up. And in Revelation 12, what does the dragon do? It persecutes, right? Did the papal supremacy persecute? It did, right? And we know the dragon would also persecute again. That's Revelation 13, where we see that he's going to make an image to the beast and persecute everyone who's not bowing down to that image. What is a lamb in the sanctuary service? It's a sacrifice, right? And we see also that paganism, when we study the daily, it's also being sacrificed, right? Question, paganism is being offered or sacrificed, so to speak, in order for papalism to come up. And Clovis is a main figure in this transition. And his wife is what? Catholic. Today we see that we're right in this transition of the United States from a lamb into a dragon. We have the study of the last president where we identify that Donald Trump is the last president. I'm suggesting that he's the last president in the switch of America being the lamb into this dragon. And what is his wife? She's a Catholic. Okay, let's continue. We saw how paganism was taken away. Then we saw on page 45 now, we saw now that Justinian made several decrees. The church forced into the wilderness. You see the head title there on page 45. We see that in 532, he made a decree and people were persecuted. So Justinian, he's the ruler in the east. And yesterday I raised the secret, so to speak. I don't know what it means, but it seems like that always the emperor of the east is supporting the west for the papal supremacy to come up. So Justinian, he's the emperor of the east, and he makes a decree that all the people who would not transfer to Catholic faith would be persecuted. They had 3 months' time to do so. If they wouldn't, they would be killed or stripped of all their belongings. So this caused a big refugee wave. which is interesting because today, in our day and age, we also have a refugee problem in the world. However, Justinian, he wants to have one faith in his kingdom. And this one faith is the faith of the Pope or the Bishop of Rome. We see here, though, under the second paragraph of the church forced into the wilderness, that many refused or withstood that decree. And a big massacre comes after that. And in 532, let's read now. That's sort of where we stopped. By the decree, can you see that? By the decree, about in the middle. By the decree of 532, Justinian reduced all true and sincere believers to the direst condition. But by the decree of 533, he exalted the papacy to the highest earthly position possible. This exaltation, however, was in decree only until success in war put it into effect. What is happening here? First, the papacy is being exalted. Later on comes the executive part, when people didn't obey it. And when I read that, this really reminded me of what happened last year. If you remember, I think it was July 27 last year. What did the State Department of the United States do? We did the study last year in the fall here at School of the Prophets. If you remember, the State Department, or the Secretary of the State Department, he made a statement. He said that the Catholic Church is much involved in gaining or giving religious freedom to the people. Do you remember that? So what is happening here? Firstly, somebody from the United States should not make such a statement. But we are seeing here that, I'm not necessarily saying that this is a fulfillment, but we can see here already a type that people who should not say things like that are lifting up the papacy by saying things like, putting it up. How can I say it? They're lifting them up and they're exalting them. Thank you. They're exalting the church, the Catholic Church, and later on the enforcement of that will come. Does it make sense? Yeah? I don't get a single yes. Are you with me? Is it early in the morning? Okay. I know it's late in the week and we heard many messages this week. Okay, let's continue reading. It therefore at first could apply only to his own territory. On the other hand, both decrees applied in Europe when in 538 the Ostrogoths in Italy were crushed and more power was given to the papacy. So by that time, the Vandals were already taken out of the way. They were crushed by Clovis, I think. And now the Ostrogoths are the last horn which need to be plucked up. And at that time, where were the Ostrogoths? They were sitting right here in Rome. So they were right at the neck of the bishop, the Bishop of Rome. On the other hand, both decrees, Justinian wrote to the Pope in 533, "We have made no delay in subjecting and uniting to your holiness all the priests of the whole earth." This sounds to me like a consecration of the entire earth to the Pope, right? In the same whole East. Sorry, I'm sorry. For me, it was a long week too. Okay. We have made no delay in subjecting, uniting to your holiness all the priests of the whole East. In the same letter, he also said, "We cannot suffer that anything which relates to the state of the church, however manifest, unquestionable, should be moved without the knowledge of your holiness, who are the head of all the churches, all the holy churches." When the news came to the success of this general in crushing the Vandals in Africa in 534, Justinian was elated. Then a historian, Gibbon, says, impatient to abolish the temporal and spiritual tyranny of the Vandals, he proceeded without delay to the full establishment of the Catholic Church. An opening having presented itself to declare war on the Ostrogoths, Justinian dispatched his general Delisarius against them. After a series of victories, the general entered Rome with his army. For me, it's an interesting detail here that it says, an opening having presented itself to declare war. When you trace down the history of Europe and the various nations who wear the crown of Western Rome, you will see that in order to bring across their cause, they're looking for opportunities where they can declare war with their enemy. And we see the Ostrogoths here, a pagan nation, which by the way were actually Christians, just on the wrong side. They were protesting the Bishop of Rome. They were looking for an opportunity to take them out of the way. We would see that over and over again in history. The Ostrogoths came with 150,000 strong, to lay siege against Justinian's army, but they were outgeneraled. They could make no headway against the city, while behind them the hostility of the people depressed them. The whole nation of the Ostrogoths had been assembled for the attack, says Thomas Hodgkin, and was almost consumed in a siege. 1 year, 9 days after commencement of the siege, he further says, an army so lately strong in triumph burned their tents and recrossed the Milvian bridge. With heavy hearts the barbarians must have thought, as they turned them northwards, upon the many graves of gallant men which they were leaving on the fatal plain. Some of them must have suspected the melancholy, truth that they had dug one grave, deeper and wider than all, the grave of the Gothic monarchy in Italy. Because of the events of this year, 538, the papacy had gained a temporal foothold. It could progressively claim independent sovereignty, and so was more able to carry out its program to secure supreme rule. What does the papacy need in order to have a supreme rule? It needs independency. And I suggest that in the 20th century, this is what Sister Tess has been sharing, as well as how the papal state again got sovereignty, independence. The papacy today has that again. They already have the independence again. They already set the stage again to have the supreme rule again. Making the papal hierarchy supreme in Italy would ultimately create a dual sovereignty there and establish a precedent for the same methods among other nations. So what is the papacy doing here? There's one country, but is it united? Not really, right? Because in it there is a king, but there is also papal supremacy in Italy. You have two powers ruling in Italy. One is the papal and one are other kings. And here it says, establish a precedent for the same methods among other nations. So what is the papal church actually trying to do? I suggest it's trying to bring civil war into other nations and then come and fix that civil war in order to gain even more influence. Because remember, go back to page 45, what does the papacy do? It's on the first head title, Subjugation of the Goths by Emperor Justinian. The second paragraph, if you see the last sentence, everywhere, says Milman, the ecclesiastics were increasing their power as mediators, negotiators of treaties, or as agents in the submission of revolt of cities. So they're sending everywhere mediators. But when do you have a mediator? What do you need for a mediator to be efficient? You need war, right? Or two parties having a different view, right? So we're seeing here, first you cause the problem, and then you solve the problem, and you are the hero. Okay, so this is what the papacy does. Let's go back, page 46. The historian Milman, commenting upon the destruction of the Ostrogoths, writes, the conquest of Italy by the Greeks was to a great extent at last the work of the Catholic clergy. Do we already know an incident like that? Maybe 1989? What happened there? Or in the previous years of 1989? Who caused the Soviet Union actually to come down? Who started that work? Wasn't it, what was he then, a priest or something? John Paul, when he was in the, where was it, Czech Republic or Poland? Poland, when he did his work, Wasn't that the Catholic clergy doing that work, bringing that wall down, sort of? The overthrow of the Gothic kingdom was to Italy an unmitigated evil. In their overthrow began the fatal policy of the Roman See, fatal at last to Italy, which never would permit a powerful native kingdom to unite Italy or a very large part of it under one dominion. Whatever it may have been to Christendom, the papacy has been the eternal, implacable foe of Italian independence and Italian unity. It makes little difference whether the self-appointed successor of Peter rules over 10 square miles or 10 million square miles. If he rules, he is verily a king as other sovereign. Today, he is the emperor of the Vatican Empire. He appoints his ambassador, coins his money, has his own postal service. Yet, why should he be made a king any more than the head of any Protestant church? Such a kingship requires a union of church and state. Such a kingdom was specially condemned by Jesus. So, what is the papacy actually trying to do? The papacy actually is a church. We saw that with clay. But what is it trying to be? Be a state, right? Question, how is the church depicted in a Bible prophecy, and how is a man depicted in a Bible prophecy? A church is a woman, and a man is a state. So what is the papacy actually trying to be? Both. The papacy is a woman, but it tries to be a man as well. Don't we see that also today? When people are trying to be men and women at the same time? Can we see that in our world today? Well, the papacy is doing the same thing. Justinian declared the Pope to be the head of all the holy churches. Through the popes forgot that this title was given by fallible men, not by God. They've never forgotten to claim that power. Okay, let's go to the next two paragraphs further. The papacy. The papacy has always held that her tradition is of equal authority with the scriptures. Having eyes like eyes of men, the papacy cried out, "More power, more power." She immediately turned her wrath upon the refugees in Italy who had fled out of the east from the decree of Justinian in order to find security under the tolerant rule of the Ostrogoth king of Theodoric. Okay? These joined the Waldensians, who were convinced that the papacy was the little horn of Daniel and the man of sin of Paul's writing. The Church of Rome accepted the persecuting policy of Justinian, even as she had accepted the exalted title he bestowed upon her. The true church were given two wings of a great eagle, that she might fly from the great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor shall be. The dark ages began. Implacable and unrelenting persecution was the resort of the church and state system. Wielding a power greater than ever existed by the Caesars, Romanism pursued the church further and further into a power greater than that ever exercised by the Caesars. Romanism pursued the church further and further into the wilderness. Excuse me, I read that twice. Nevertheless, affliction and trials caused the persecuted church to live on, shining brighter and brighter until at the hand of God's providence her persecutor received a deadly wound. When was the deadly wound? 1798. When the 1260 years ended, Ophelius passed on. The church of the emperors, which he had ignored and whose teaching he refused to impart to the hordes of the north, later destroyed the sovereignty of those nations who professed his faith. They were conquered neither by New Testament teaching nor by missionary effort, but by the sword. Though independent rule was taken away from the Gothic people lived on. They were in subjection, but they evinced no great love for the mysterious oracles of faith taught by the lash of the whip. Deprived of material weapons, they become deprived of martial. Thank you. They became an easy prey to the rapidly advanced Franks. Nevertheless, one can follow the stirring movements among the descendants as they listened to the men mighty in the prophecies and faith of Jesus. The days dawned when others came in the spirit and power of Ophelius. Such contributed their part when the hour came to have the Bible once more exalted as the center of Christian life and belief. So this is the portion of the Truth Triumphant, not Church Triumphant. And now this is the next quote is Uriah Smith. So we see now that the papacy is on the beast. It is ruling the 10 kings of Europe. And great deal, or how it's being put in place, the beginning of that is Clovis. Up to 508, it's working on gaining his own influence everywhere. And with Clovis, it's starting to be connected to civil authority out open. And from this moment on, it's going to rule the kings, having the crown of Rome. Interesting for me here, before we move on, is that here it says, deprived of martial weapons, they became an easy prey to the rapidly advancing Franks. What does martial weapons mean? Weapons of war. So what does this remind you of? Don't you have an amendment in the Constitution about weapons? Wasn't there discussions already if those should be changed? If the people of the United States should not have weapons? Be like the people in Europe, have not allowed to have weapons? I don't know how many of you know the history of Robert Blum. It is a history of a German revolution which took place in Germany after the French Revolution. And Robert Blum was the primary fighter for a democracy in Germany. And if you want to watch, we did it last year at School of the Prophets. It gives much input to November 9, because on November 9th, Robert Blum was executed for being this fighter for democracy, indicating that probably on November 9th, 2019, democracy will end. Or I must explain as well, if you look at the ideas of Robert Blum and the democracy back then, it represents true republicanism in America. So I would suggest that republicanism, the lamp, is dying at November 9th and the dragon is being raised. However, once this revolution failed, the civil war ended, you know what the punishment was to the people? All the weapons of the people were taken away in Germany. So it feels to me like, or it seems to me like, something will happen about these weapons in the United States after the Civil War is over. And we see even here that the people were deprived from their martial weapons and became an easy prey to the rapidly advancing Franks. As I said, I'm not nearly done with the study. You can probably see how big it is, and time is running. I said from the beginning, I only share what I've done so far. Okay, just to give you an example on the influence of the papacy, which had it from 538 onwards now. This influence over the kings of the earth. Let me see where it is. It is on page 42. And you're probably all familiar with the story. So the Pope is now the head, so to speak, and it's ruling together with the kings. But I'm thinking maybe we should do something else beforehand. Maybe we do something else beforehand, I'm sorry. Let's go back and let's read one more thing about Clovis on page 52. Page 52, the last two paragraphs, we see Clovis. So we talked already enough about Clovis and how he helped the papacy to come up. However, let's read the first sentence. Clovis, from 466 to 511, was the first king of the Franks to unite all the Frankish tribes under one ruler, changing the form of leadership from a group of royal chieftains to rule by a single king, ensuring that the kingship was passed down to the heirs. What is Clovis doing? He's becoming a dictator. So this is the territory of the Franks, but the Franks, they had several tribes. It was not just one tribe. It is basically like the United States. You have one country, yet those various states. And what does he do? Clovis was the first king of the Franks to unite all of the Frankish tribes under one ruler. So what is he doing? He is creating unity among their own country under one head, under the Clovis crown. So I'm suggesting he's ending civil war and he's becoming a dictator. And we see that over and over in history again, and in the remaining time we will go through some kings and show that. And I suggest that the same will happen to the United States. We see the country is divided, but it will have to be united again. And when it's united, it will be united under a dictator. And let's read on. Clovis is also significant due to his conversion to Catholicism in 496, largely at the behest of his wife, Clotilde, who would later be venerated as a saint for this act, celebrated today in both the Roman Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox Church. Clovis was baptized on Christmas Day in 508. The adoption by Clovis of Catholicism, as opposed to Arianism of the most other Germanic tribes, led to widespread conversion among the Frankish people, to religious unification across what is now modern-day France, Belgium, and Germany, and 3 centuries later to Charlemagne's alliance with the Bishop of Rome, and the middle of the 10th century under Otto I the Great, to the consequent birth of the Holy Roman Empire. So we're going to consider both. We considered Clovis now, and we're going to consider next Charlemagne, or his name is also Charles the Great, and Otto the Great. Those are the 2 next kings we will consider. However, so Clovis is uniting his own country. He's establishing the Frankish kingdom. Now the crown will be passed on, and Charles the Great, he's the next Frankish king. I think he's 3 generations after Clovis. And he is establishing his kingdom among Europeans, and he's paving the way for the Holy Roman Empire. If you turn 1 page back, 51, page 51, you see the 3 kingdoms and the 4th. Can you see it? The first one is the Holy Roman Empire of Germinations, and we already considered the eagle, right? 2-headed. What does it signify that the eagle is 2-headed? Dominion over the east and the west of what? The Roman Empire, right? Rome continues. So here we see now the Holy Roman Empire of Germinations. This is the first empire after Rome was divided into 10 kingdoms, and this kingdom lasted almost 1,000 years. Let's read now about Charles the Great. Charles the Great is either called Charles the Great or Charlemagne. And the funny thing is, the French and the Germans, they fight over if Charles the Great is now French or German. Let me see, Paris. But I say it's both, because Charles the Great, his empire was actually all the way from Spain to all the way to the east here and down to Rome. That's how big his empire was. But his capital was in Germany. Okay, let's read. Charles the Great. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, number Charles I, was the king of the Franks from 1789, king of the Lombards. The Lombards are ruling in the northern Italy from 7074. Pardon me? I'm so sorry. Page 53, under the title from Charles the Great. Page 53. So Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, number Charles I, was king of the Franks from 768, king of the Lombards from 74, and Holy Roman Empire from 800. What does it mean to be the ruler of the Holy Roman Emperor, or Holy Roman Empire? We'll talk about that in a bit. He united much of Western and Central Europe during the Middle Ages. He was the first recognized emperor to rule from Western Europe since the fall of the Western Roman Empire 3 centuries earlier. So what are we seeing here? Rome is dissolved into West and East, and then here we have 10 kings, 10 fragments. Clovis, he's the one paving the way for the papacy. He's paving the way for again to have one empire. And Charles the Great, he comes along and he creates this one empire again. He takes those 10 fragments and he tries to put them under his rulership again together. So if you remember, we read from Uriah Smith that the clay and the iron, and also in Daniel 2 we can read it, they try to mingle but it doesn't click. They always separate itself again. So first we saw how everything was broken apart. Now we are in a time period where everything comes together again. I guess we could call it also a scattering or a gathering time. Right now we would be again in a gathering time, as a counterfeit gathering time. So let's see it. He was the first recognized emperor to rule from Western Europe since the fall of the Western Roman Empire 3 centuries earlier. The expanded Frankish state of Charlemagne founded is called the Caroline Empire, who was later canonized by anti-pope Partial III. Charlemagne was the eldest son of Pipin the Short and Pedrada of Laon, born before the canonical marriage. He became king in 768 following his father's death, initially as co-ruler with his brother Carloman I. Carloman's sudden death in December 771, under unexplained circumstances, left Charlemagne as the ruler of the Frankish kingdom. He continued his father's policy towards the papacy and became its protector, removing the Lombards from the power. Removing the Lombards from power in northern Italy and leading an incursion into Muslim Spain. He campaigned against the Saxons in the east, Christianizing them upon penalty of death and leading to events such as the massacre of Verdun. He reached the height of his power in 800 when he was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day at Rome's Old St. Peter's Basilica. Let's read the last paragraph and then we'll talk about it because there is much information in this paragraph. Charlemagne has been called the father of Europe, as he united most of Western Europe for the first time since the classical era of the Roman Empire and united parts of Europe that had never been under Frankish rule. His rule supremed the Caroline Renaissance, a period of energetic cultural, intellectual activity within the West Church. All Holy Roman emperors considered their kingdoms to be descendants of Charlemagne's empire, as did the French and German monarchies. Okay. What did Charles the Great do? It's kind of hard to summarize hours of material and information and details into a few minutes at a camp meeting. However, it said in here that Charles the Great continued the policy of his father towards the Bishop of Rome. So what did Charles the Great's father do? When Charles the Great was a kid, the Bishop of Rome paid a visit to the father of Charles the Great. And remember, the Bishop of Rome had already the connection with the Franks due to Clovis. They were already united. So what had happened was that the Bishop of Rome was only in Rome and had small physical territories around Rome. And these territories sometimes were threatened by other kings. So the Bishop of Rome reached out to the father of Charles the Great for help. And the father granted this help. And Charles the Great, sees that, he observes that. And when he grows up, he considers himself, as we read, to be the protector of the papacy. Charles the Great, you would actually consider a very faithful Catholic. He has the kingdom of the Franks, and he wants to expand it. But his slogan was always one empire, one faith, under one ruler. And if it's not accomplished by peace, he will use the sword. And that was his method. That was the same method Clovis had. Always one empire, under one ruler, with one faith, the Catholic faith. And his greatest enemy were the Saxons. So who are the Saxons? The Saxons were a tribe here in the northern atmosphere of Germany, more or less. Today there is a state even called still Saxons. So you have Charles the Great. He's expanding his kingdom all the way here, and even here down to Italy. But his greatest enemy in pain are the Saxons, because they refuse to obey to Charles the Great. So the Saxons, they are also driven into England then because of these wars. And interesting is that the English law, which we talk about, is it comes from the Saxons. So we have here the controversy also between Roman law and English law. When we see the battle of Charles the Great and the Saxons. And by the way, the picture on 53, that was the kingdom of Charles the Great. And so Charles the Great, he wanted to Christianize those Saxons, and by penalty of death. And there was one guy, his name is Widukind. He led the greatest rebellion against Charles the Great. And that led once to the massacre of Verden, where Charles the Great had executed 4,500 Saxons, just to give an example how strongly he wanted to win this battle and Christianize all these Saxons. There would be more details to that. However, when they have this war going on, and both parties are growing tired of that war. And finally, Widukind, he subdues, and he's baptized into the Catholic faith, not because he professes it, but because he wants to save his own people and his own culture. So he gives in. We see here how the Frankish power is so powerful, it absorbs everyone and everything. However, after he has conquered the Saxons, he reaches his height of his power in 800. In 800, we have now the birth of the Roman Holy Empire, where Clovis paved the way. He has now the crown of the Western Roman Empire. And interesting is, he's crowned at the cathedral in Rome. And when he is crowned, when you read about it, is that he acknowledges the Pope as his spiritual leader and king on this earth. But in return, the Pope said that the king would be his, his earthly king and protector. So I think this statement, this scene is perfectly describing what is happening between the kings of this earth and this papacy, the papacy. The kings of the earth, in this case, it's Charles the Great, is recognizing the Pope as their spiritual leader, while the papacy is recognizing the king as their earthly protector and king. So they're both equal. They both bring something to the table. And they both need each other. Yet, though, we will see also how they hate each other. Can you see that? Can you see that relationship? This is the kind of relationship we will see today. We see already that when a new president is elected, where do they go to? They go and pay the Pope a visit, right? So, and I will give you now the example of what happens when the kings were not doing what the Pope wanted to do. So we see now this relationship between the kings and the papacy. Now we are seeing the beginning of the First Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. And let's go now to page, where were we before, where I said we should go? Page 42. So page 42 perfectly reflects now this hate-love relationship between the kings of the earth, those 10 kings, and the Pope. And this might be a very famous story. In Germany, this is actually a saying, and it's the road to Canossa. And when you say that, it means that you completely humbled yourself. And Ellen White knew about the story, and she added it to the great controversy. Let's read the quotes there. Great Controversy, page 57, 58. A striking illustration of the tyrannical character of this advocate of infallibility was given in his treatment of the German Emperor Henry IV. For pursuing to disregard the Pope's authority, this monarch was declared to be excommunicated and dethroned. So what happened here? When you look at the history, Henry IV, he didn't really care about the papacy. He didn't care about it, what it said or not. And he was to wear this crown. He wore the crown later on from Charles the Great. So this is decades later. So he was the king of the Holy Roman Empire, and he didn't care about the papacy. And the papacy just said, you are excommunicated. So what happens? Terrified by the desertion and threats of his own princes, who were encouraged in rebellion against him by the papal mandate, Henry felt the necessity of making his peace with Rome. So Henry IV, he doesn't care about Rome. He wouldn't even care if he's excommunicated. What is he fearing? He's fearing his princes. Because what happened? You see how Clovis was a dictator? So when you look at the Holy Roman Empire, you had the Holy Roman Empire, and you had various nations in it. And those various nations had all kings. But there would be this one supreme crown. And Henry IV was wearing this crown. However, the princes had to be loyal to this crown. But when the papacy would withdraw their support to this crown, as we saw they gave Charles the Great, these princes were freed from the loyalty to this crown. So do you see, does it come across easy to understand? These princes had no longer to be loyal. And these princes, of course, they are all striving for supremacy. So the Pope knew if he's withdrawing his support, it's going to cause much headache to the Henry IV. And Henry IV was given 1 year to make peace with the Pope again. Otherwise, these princes would have taken their loyalty from him. So see what he does. In company with his wife and faithful servant, he crossed the Alps in midwinter that he might humble himself before the Pope. Upon reaching the castle whither Gregory had withdrawn, he was conducted without his guards into an outer court, and there, in the severe cold of winter, with uncovered head and naked feet and in miserable dress, he awaited the Pope's permission to come into his presence. Not until he had continued 3 days fasting and making confession did the pontiff condescend to grant him pardon. Even then, it was only upon condition that the emperor should await the sanction of the Pope before resuming the insignia or exercising the power of royalty. And Gregory, elated with his triumph, boasted that it was his duty to pull down the bride of kings. How striking the contrast between the overbearing pride of his haughty pontiff and the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who represented himself as pleading at the door of the heart of admittance, that he may come in to bring pardon and peace, who taught his disciples, whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. So that's from chapter 3 in the Great Controversy. So we see here the Pope has to grant him again, or forgive him, to restore him to this authority, where that would also have to restore the loyalty of these princes to that crown. So the story, if you look on, that was just a pure political move of Henry IV, because he knew that the Pope, I think it was Gregory, he was the head of the churches, and he knew that this Pope had to forgive him. It was his Christian duty. So he did what he did with the Road of Canossa, but again, it was just a political move. And the funny thing is that right after this incident, when the power was given again to Henry IV, he went and he took down the Pope and put another one in place. So this is the kind of hate and love relationship between the papacy and the kings of this earth. If one didn't like each other, they used their methods to bring the other one down. But at the same time, they needed one another to actually have the power they were claiming to have. Do you get this? So when Francis is striving for the global reach of the Pope Francis, the new Roman Empire, we see that these same things have to happen again. These same kind of relationships have to happen again. We see how these same methods are being used again to have this influence over the people as well as the states. So now we are under the Holy Roman Empire of Germinations, which lasted about 1,000 years. Let's go, 4 minutes left. That's too little time. One more thing about Charles the Great. After Charles the Great was done warring, one thing which happens is often that these kings, once they created this one empire, they have a cultural influence. And also Charles the Great, you can read through the notes which I put there, which by the way are all from Wikipedia. He does a lot of educational reforms. I think he has a money reform, he has reform of the writing, he's unifying the writing style among the tribes, as well as he has also a church reform. So we see here a civil authority reforming the church. And you see that on the bottom of page 53, church reforms. His reforms focused on strengthening the church's power structure. What is he doing, his reforms? He wants to strengthen the church power structure, improving clergy skill and moral quality, standardizing liturgical practices, improvements on the basic tenets of the faith, and the rooting out of paganism. His authority extended over church and state. He could discipline clerics, control ecclesiastical property, and define orthodox doctrine. Despite the harsh legislation and sudden change, he had developed support from the clergy, who approved his desire to deepen the piety and morals of his subject. In 809 to 810, Charlemagne called the council in Aachen. So Aachen is right here. This is the capital of him. He was the first king to actually have a capital. Beforehand, these tribes, they were always moving. The kings of these tribes, they were moving around in the country. Charles the Great was one of the first ones to actually fix a place in his kingdom, and Aachen was right in the center of his kingdom, to have a fixed place where he would rule from. So he's calling out now a church council. As a statement, he's defining now faith, because what is he doing? Called the Church Council in Aachen, which confirmed the unanimous belief in the West that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, and sanctioned inclusions in this Nicene Creed of the phrase Philoke and the Son. So I find it interesting, and time is running out, we can't really speak much about it anymore. But we see here that he is involving himself in church issues. He's also creating a Sunday law in his time period. He's saying that nobody is allowed to work at Sunday. Everyone is to rest. That is what the church reforms he did. And we see here he's even involved in the Godhead issue, in the Trinity issue. He's defining what the Holy Spirit is. Okay, so I would strongly encourage you to continue with the study. We've recorded much of it last year at School of the Prophets, as well as at the recent School of the Prophets program in Portugal. We went through detail of these histories. You can check these out. In my last words, I tried to summarize the last things. The next emperor now would be Otto the Great. And Otto the Great, you see on page 54, there's a crown. And this is actually the crown, this picture, the crown of the Holy Roman Empire. And now it's in the museum in Vienna. You can still see the crown. This is the crown of the Western Roman Empire, which was given from one king to the next king. And the last king of this Roman Empire was Francis II, which you see on page 55. He is the last Holy Roman Empire, which ruled this time in Vienna. So what happened was, when we look and consider Daniel 2, where we see always a mingling and then a coming apart again. This is the same what we're seeing in Europe. We see people, kings like Charles the Great, he's creating one big empire, and he's creating it under the Catholic faith. Once he is at his height, he's reaching out to Rome. But once this king is gone, his kingdom will be broken up again into various pieces, till the next king starts and rises and creates again one big empire. For example, after Charles the Great, his kingdom crumbled into various different kingdoms, and then you have Otto the Great, which is now a Saxon, which is interesting because the Saxons were the worst enemies of the Franks. He is rising now, and he's creating one empire in Europe. And he's also creating an empire under one faith, the Catholic faith. But also his kingdom crumbled slowly and slowly, till the next person comes up. And this is for about 1,000 years, till Francis I basically is the last kingdom. What weakened the kingdom of the Holy Roman Empire? What weakened again the empire of Rome? It was the Reformation. Because the Reformation divorced the kings with the papacy. It divorced that relationship and taught again the church and state should not be united. It weakened it so much that till it came to the point of Napoleon, who actually signed the divorce paper, and the deadly wound was inflicted. The papacy had not the civil authority anymore. And by the time period of Napoleon, we have the crown in a country which is now called Austria. But Napoleon, who is he fighting? Who was the first person, the first nation Napoleon was conquering? It was Austria. And then he goes to Rome. So what does Napoleon do? He first conquers the civil power of the Roman Empire, and then also the spiritual power, the Pope. So he has both crowns, and then Napoleon crowns himself. And with Napoleon, the empire continues. That is, for me, a legitimate reason to say why Napoleon and the story of Napoleon typifies the United States, because he's wearing that crown of Western Rome. But Napoleon, what happens to him? He's also defeated, right? And then in history, what you have is the second empire, which you find on 51. It's called the German Empire. What is the German Empire? The German Empire is the time period under the Kaiser. Do you know what the Kaiser is? It's actually just a German word for emperor. This is the time period of Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm I and II, leading up to the First World War. They are wearing now the crown of Western Roman Empire, which I suggest gives us license that the First World War typifies what is happening with the United States today. But also this empire crumbles because what? Germany lost the First World War. Why? Because the Americans came. I'm teasing. So, but now we have Hitler. And what is Hitler's kingdom called? The Third Reich. So Reich is actually just a German word for kingdom. But I know in the English language, it's specifically for Hitler's kingdom, the Third Reich. So it has a little bit of a negative touch to the word Reich, which technically just means kingdom. So why is it called the Third Reich? When we have the third angel's message, what do we say? We can't have a third without a second and a first. So my question was, when Hitler has the third kingdom, there must have been a second and a first. And I listed them up to you here. That's why they're numbered 1, 2, 3. I suggest to you that Hitler looked back in history and he understood history. He understood what was happening to Rome, how it was divided, how those crown was given to these kings and succeeded in history. And what did Hitler want to do? He just wanted to do the same as Charles the Great. You know that in Europe, Charles the Great is praised as this awesome person. He killed 4,500 people just because they were believing in their own faith and not in Christianity. Hitler didn't do anything else. He did the same as these people which we are praising today, but Hitler somehow is the bad guy. He's just as bad as Charles the Great and all the others who rose up to make their their country great again, create one empire. And always at the height of their dominion, what do? They reach out to Rome. We constantly see that in history. What did Hitler do? Was Hitler a true Catholic? No, he was not interested in religion at all. But why does he have this connection to the Pope? Because Hitler understood history, and he knew he had to connect to the Pope again. But what was Hitler's dream? Hitler wanted to create one nation, didn't he? Under German dominion, right? And how long should it last? 1,000 years, right? But he failed, right? Again, because of the Americans. But I suggest that the crown is now with the Americans, which puts also a big burden on the American nation, because we should learn from history. But America is going to repeat that history. What is America at the moment saying? Make America great again. This is exactly the same what Hitler did previous to the Second World War. This is again what Kaiser Wilhelm I did previous to the First World War. This is again the same what Clovis did, Charles the Great did, Otto did, all these people. History is just repeating itself. And just as they are at the height of its power, what do? They reach out to Rome. And this is exactly this time period again, which we're about to face. And we've considered, time is up, I'm already over time, but we've considered a little bit how this will work, how this relationship will come together, how does Rome work. I hope it was comprehensive for you, and that we understand now what it means when Pope Francis is striving for the global, has a global reach, that he wants to create a new Roman Empire. What does that mean? He's just wanting to create again that relationship we had in the past. But today, the crown is on America. In the year 1989, we saw already how these two come together, and we'll see coming them together again. And one last point, Hitler wanted a 1,000-year German dominion. What do Protestants want? 1,000 years of peace. What is Trump? Trump is a Protestant, right? And he's supported by a lot of the Protestants. They want 1,000 years of peace. And remember, we talked about the world peace? Remember what we said this world peace meant? Clovis wanted to stop the invasion of the Teutonics. Well, this means that we have a dictator. World peace means to have a dictator under the dominion of one ruler and the Pope. So we should be careful what we wish for in that sense. Anyway, my time is up. I hope you enjoyed the study. I hope everyone will research a little bit more. There's enough material out there already recorded in English where you can listen more to these stories and see the parallels of these kingdoms. Let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for the records of history, Lord, that we can see how history is repeating over and over again. Lord, we live in solemn times where we see how church and state are coming together, and we've missed a lot of the details on how far we're already into this, in these movements. Lord, the only safety is that we might be ready for all of this, and that we are hidden in Christ so we may be able to stand. Lord, we ask you, as this camp meeting comes slowly to its close, that we make use of the time we have here with among fellow brethren, and that we go home and be blessed by this camp meeting, but that we not forget the things we learned here, but that we continue and with more effort study and prepare ourselves. We ask you also, as we partner for a break, that you refresh us and that we can come back together again and study more. In Jesus' name we thank you for that. Amen.